I want to start exactly where Caroline left off in the mid-1970s when I first met Ed, and I was teaching a course called Man, Forms of Expression. That was before gender-neutral language. It was also 3 professors sitting around a table in a circular room with 18 students. One taught poetry and literature, that was Eric Wright. One taught philosophy and music, John Stratton. And I taught art history, not photo history. It was a very important time for photography in the context of art history. It was the time of the beginning of the photo market, and it was a time when young photographers working in the analog mode had a great future ahead of them. So I think you can imagine that Ed was quite a good student. That's from my point of view. And I think he particularly, I remember him enjoying the history of art of the 18th and 19th century, the Enlightenment and Romanticism. And he's talked about that in his own life. His work, I think, comes from a tradition of art history and of photography. And that's where I want to start tonight and move from the 18th and 19th century to the present and trace the influences, if you like, or the roots of some of the art that we see today. So I want to start with a word and a concept and a philosophical concept, and that is the sublime. I want to start with an artist who you mentioned in your work, and that's Caspar David Friedrich. Tell us, what compels you?
Well, actually, it was in your class, and it was 1976.
Damn, I'm sorry you said that.
Oh, sorry.
It was in the 70s.
It was in the 70s. And I had just come to Toronto from St. Catharines. And it was actually a teacher that was teaching photography in St. Catharines, actually at Welland, Niagara College, who said, hey, you have this natural aptitude for taking pictures. Every time I give an assignment, yours is like 5 times more interesting than anybody else's, and you should maybe go to Ryerson, which is one of the best schools. And that's how I found myself here in Toronto, and moving from St. Catharines to Toronto. And then in that first year in that course, I had not been exposed to the history of art. I had not had that kind of training or music, and for me, those broader, like even man forms of perception was sociology with Marie Pomerantz and others. And we were learning a whole range of things, which I thought was a fantastic foundation year. But I certainly recall sitting up and noticing the images of Caspar David Friedrich when the paintings, in particular the ship trapped in ice and this kind of ship dwarfed by the forces of nature, which really kind of mirrored the Moby Dick story as well, and the great whale and Ahab. And again, the notion that the sublime was nature, and we were diminished and dwarfed and both fearful and awed by the forces of nature. And there was something about that kind of diminishment that I thought was really interesting when there's a greater force that we can kind of perceive. And also Caspar David Friedrich was, to me, when I started looking into him more, he was one of the first romantic artists who, pulled the gaze away from, painting, the portraits of the bourgeois or their farms or their cattle, or, the landscape painting was largely the landscape of ownership or the landscape of church or state, and it was rarely ever. And so the notion that an artist or a painter would spend time and canvas and energy painting a lowly bush or a lowly tree was actually new to that time. It was like that wasn't considered worthy of subject. But at the same time, it was really the beginning of a kind of a deeper reverence for nature, which I think belonged in the Chinese tradition for 1,000 years, where they painted, on their, ceramics nature for 1,000 years, and a reverence for nature. But that wasn't really, because I guess at the time the clients for the painters were the church, the bourgeois, or the state, and someone painting just on their own wasn't really, considered a practice that someone would do. But he did break off, and he did find subjects that were outside of the normal subject matter of the day.
And the paintings were made up of a lot of nothing, a lot of emptiness, a lot of hovering atmosphere.
Like
people look
almost,
voids, and that inspired awe in the forces of nature. And as you say, as an example, the Wreck of the Hope, in the effects of nature without man, the absolute immensity of nature, the overpowering of nature, the overpowering of man by nature. Did you find that attractive?
Yeah, and nature as a spiritual force, that it was, that up until then it was like God was the spiritual force, but here you can just be in the mountains and experience the grandness and the openness.
Or looking at the sea.
Right, and that to me was a really interesting approach. And then, of course, Melville and Moby Dick is of that same thing. And Turner, when he started painting, the ships being lost at sea, it's the same thing. This small ship dwarfed by a gale-force winds and storms, with angry clouds and ferocious waves, and these were again paintings where we have been subsumed by nature. That nature was the omnipresent force, and we were the kind of the victims of that force. And I think in many ways that informed me in some ways and then following on that and starting with looking at nature, but again trying not to move to the kinds of, because all of that work, that kind of view has literally moved to cliche, moved to almost like the calendar picture, or the paintings that you see in the mall where the guy, is knocking them off. It's that same idea of the vastness of nature, the beautiful mountainscapes and all that. So I was interested in nature, but I wasn't interested in the cliched view of it, that I wanted to find another way to look at it. And then, leading to this work, it was the very beginnings was taking a large format camera and just seeing how far I can go with the 4x5 camera into detail and still resolve it with that camera.
Was that your first camera, 4x5?
Well, it was 35 was my first, but when I really got serious with photography, it was because in many ways I thought, okay, one of the strengths of photography and looking at the history of photography, I call it the ultimate realist tool. So when photography came along, the realist painters, I think, were kind of left wondering what to do. And I think Impressionism arguably may have come out of the fact that they had to differentiate themselves from the power of photography and the way it articulated reality in a way that even the best realist painter couldn't quite do that, because that is actually a more deeper mirroring of nature than any painting could ever be. So when I went with a large format camera, I remember even like at that time, color was being taught, and most of the people who were doing color photography or 4x5 it was more commercial. Like black and white street photography was the thing at the time. If you're going to be an artist, you go out there and you do a kind of Lee Freelander, Gary Winogrand, look on the street, and I tried it and I didn't like it, but this other part of the course, which was learning how to use a large format with color, tweaked my interest. And it was because it resolved a detail at such a level, and I was interested in that ability to, as prints, to make beautiful prints and to have everything so articulated, that was one of the things that captured me. And I remember even at the time, I was saying, well, that's a really commercial tool. If you're really interested in the arts, you should really be following like black and white. Everybody who's serious is black and white. And I said, but no, I don't see any reason why color can't be used as an art form. And that's how early it was. Like there was maybe Stephen Shore was working with it.
Eggleston.
Was that Eggleston? There was like
But
three or four.
nothing like what you were intending to do, because Shore and Eggleston weren't really working with the sublime. They
Joel
weren't-
Meyerowitz was also maybe, and Elliot Porter was actually somebody who did actually go deep into color
Right.
and more along this line. So I thought, well, there's something interesting, and that's where I kind of learned the technique of color photography. I learned, how to, focus. And to me, I loved it because unlike like 35 millimeter where you're just shooting from the hip, it's like once you've got your technique down, you can, you barely even have to look through, you just go click and it's done. And whereas it's almost like that slow cooking or the slow movement that when you want to shoot with 4x5, you have a tripod and you decide what you want to do, and then you lay out your tripod, you put your camera, you find your frame, you focus it, you test it out with a Polaroid, you continue to focus it, so you're tweaking. It takes maybe 20 minutes to a half hour before you actually take the picture. So it's everything about methodology, and it's everything about being slow and conscious about what you're trying to do. So these things aren't accidents, they're very much considered and shaped by your presence at that time and working with the light.
And let's talk about presence for a moment in these pictures, and I'm going to connect that to Friedrich and to the notion of the awe-inspiring emotional effects of nature, because you're asking, you were present, and your presence is quite a strong aspect, the looking and the inviting us to participate in that kind of meditation of these forms, these brambles. But you said just a few minutes ago that there's a spiritual, and I totally agree with you, in the work of Friedrich, and I'm wondering if there's a spiritual aspect. I don't think I've ever read anything about you which talks about any kind of spirituality, but I might have missed something. This is, to me, a view of nature that translates into the spiritual. What would you respond to that?
Well, I do think, when I was doing this, and I've always thought of it, is that one of the things that, we as Canadians have been blessed with, and I speak about this when I tour around in the world as well, is that if let's say you were born and raised in Holland, and and somebody said, what is nature, or like what is a wilderness, and and every square meter in Holland, half it's been reclaimed from the sea, everything's been divided up, and if there's a tree there or a small little forest there, it's because somebody wanted it there, and somebody let it be there or planted it or whatever. Whereas here, if you just go a bit, north, and you can get into some what I would call wilderness, how nature intended that landscape to look, and that landscape, has persevered through time. So I'm looking at something that may have looked very similar 1 million years from now, or 2 million years from before, and that you're looking at something that's almost cosmic and geological time when you're in that place, and you have to be in that total wilderness. So I was an avid camper, and that connection to nature. I was actually quite religious and came out a Catholic, and I was an altar boy, but I kind of did a break when I was about 14 and 13, 14, where I could break from it. And then for me, the reason I know I was doing that was it felt like it had meaning, that there was some reason for my existence, for being here, and it felt like there were answers there. And then I was able to kind of move to nature and fall in love with the natural world as an alternative to why I'm here, and possibly following a more Darwinism in a way, that we are from nature, and that to me suited my temperament and my kind of practical, logical mind in a better way. And so looking at nature and trying to understand why I feel certain ways in nature. So if like, why is it that when we look, and I think it's universal, when you look at a campfire, you kind of stare into it, you get drawn into it. Well, that's probably in the archetypes that I also learned about, Jungian archetypes and collective consciousness, but in those archetypes, this is something that we as humans have been in front of a fire for hundreds, like 80,000 years ago when we found it and were able to control it, and we've been looking at it ever since. So I think there's a deep fascination with it. And so in terms of a spiritual place, there is something to me that connects, and even in work like this, I almost I call it natural order.
Definitely in work like this.
But I almost want to call it enduring order, in that we've come onto the scene fairly recently in geological time, and we may leave the scene, but somehow I think this will endure. This kind of structure, this kind of life will continue, even if we as mammals won't continue, or other mammals go extinct. This will not go extinct. I think this planet will always, until the sun can no longer provide, will always have this imprint of nature will persevere. And when you look at these, to me, they're also very much as if I was peering into my own body. That the system of bringing nutrient to the far edges and bringing leaves and bringing the sun and bringing life to it is no different than our veins and our nervous systems and our brains are all that same kind of tree-like patterns and branches that keep us. And there is a kind of a body that I feel I was also looking into the kind of fractal structures that exist within us that also exist in nature outside of us.
But let me push that, and let's talk about even religious symbolism. Do you see any symbolism in a series? Is it intentional, that begins with the emptiness of winter and ends with the promise of spring? Is there, beyond the supernatural, a religious impulse there? Is there something left over from your Catholic childhood, you think?
I think so. I mean, I think you're all, I mean, artists, I think if you're there, and you give your life to that practice, it is by far trying to make sense of your life and try to find meaning and try to find the things that somehow, you can connect in your own mind that help you to kind of understand the world. And I think as artists, we mediate that kind of feeling and the things that we sense into manifestations of things in the world, so that we kind of are the medium through which the ideas can go and manifest. So for me, it's like that idea of the winter and the kind of almost the death, the blanket over life, and then the rebirth of that life is for sure something that happened, and this body of work occurred in many ways out of the fact that our overreach in nature, and that we're in these wet markets in China, and I've been to them. My first trip to China ever was in 2002 in Wuhan, and I went to a wet market within my second day in China. I went, whoa. This is crazy. And you see these animals you've never seen before, and they're all being traded, live and dead. And that's kind of where that transferred. So I'm sitting up in the country, and this virus had sprung from this place I know. And it's that overreach, it's us going into nature in a way where we don't really belong, and we're, getting, with 8 billion of us and the need for protein and everything, it's keep getting us further and further into corners and, pangolins and these belief systems that are there. And that's come back to us. It's come back, and now it's pinned the whole world down as a result of, the human world down as a result of that jump. And then I'm there isolating up north at this particular time, when it's still winter, beginning, so I got up at March 12th, I was there, and I didn't leave for 5 months, except coming back to the city to do, meetings and to, once the project got started, to look at prints and work with the team here to kind of create this and the book, etc. But it was kind of somehow fitting that it was our kind of abuse of nature in ways that prevented me from going to do the trip that I was going to do, which is a trip to Africa to continue exploring the kind of progress of globalism and how China was operating in Africa and continuing on that idea. And I couldn't. So I ended up saying, okay, I've got this new camera, I'm here, and how do I begin to make sense of to do something in this period of time? And I thought a deep kind of, again, being in the presence of nature and trying to understand it, and building off of some work that I did back in the early 80s with that falling in love with originally with the 4x5 camera, and going full circle back to that after almost 40 years of looking how we're kind of pushing nature back.
Right, so it was the very climax of human intervention and the destruction of the natural order, the virus that was caused by that drives you. That's very important. That drives you to a reconnection with the most fundamental forms and the quietest meditative presence that you have in nature. So was the Africa trip postponed indefinitely, or is it on the cards?
It's still on the cards if things open up and we can travel again and it's safe to go to countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Egypt. So it's still up in the air as to when that happens. So it's like everybody, I'm sure, in the room, make any plans you want, but be prepared to change them.
I think we're all grateful that it didn't happen right then. I think we're grateful for this. Let me turn away from the religious symbolism, if it's there, to the size, because of course Friedrich's paintings, back to him, were very small.
Yeah, they were. I was always surprised when I saw them.
Yeah.
They were like, and I was expecting such a big thing brought down to that.
But there are other romantic painters like Church and Turner whose work was very large, and size is very important here. Tell us about that.
Well, I find that that these works, when people look at them online or even worse, their phone, that you can't get what I'm talking about. And I think that like the bigger ones here are 60 by 80 inches, and then the smaller ones are 48 by 64, so 4 by 5 feet sort of. And what happens, and what was always interesting in my work, I've always made work to be enlarged. I mean, and back when I was at early days at Ryerson, a large color print was 20 by 24 inches. That was considered like you're going big.
Yeah.
And now my smallest size in this series is 48 by 64, right? So it's just there's a whole other thing that happens.
How difficult is it to print these so large?
I mean, it's these are now being printed, and there's a whole other kind of, as a printmaker, digital has become a real blessing, because what I could never do back in the world of film is that I had two types of film I could actually use. One was a softer portrait-like film that Kodak made, so we're doing portraits, and it was a little flatter. And then there was a VCS, which is Vericolor commercial film. And it was a little punchier. So I had two choices, a slight bit punchier or flatter. So if it was a punchier day, I would use the flatter film, and if it was a flat day, I used the punchier film. And that was it. Those are my levers. Those are the only things I had. And then I had to fit that reality that I was looking at onto that film that would then fit onto one type of paper that there wasn't any, like in black and white, you had contrast grades and you had warm tones, cool tones. You had a lot of variety you can do in black and white that you can kind of mix up your chemistries and get different things, and you get in there and you can change it up quite a bit. In color, whatever was on that negative translated onto that paper. If you had a problem, you had a problem. So it was very demanding in film, and you couldn't kind of mess up at the front end. You had to get it all right. And that's when I started learning about the chain being as strong as its weakest link. So you learn about the best optic and the best film and then how to get the ideal processing, because if you mess that up, you've lost it there. And then you have to go back to the right light box that can spread the light evenly across that area and not be uneven and not have different color variations. Then you have to put a lens at the other end of it, which was just as strong and as good as the lens that you captured it with. And then you had to have the paper, and it had to be matched to the quality of the negative that could give you that result. And then you had to process that color paper in a standard process, and it couldn't deviate off of that either. So anything along that line that wasn't at optimum 100%, you would have a problem. It wouldn't be the best.
You'd have to do it again.
Or redo it again, or it wouldn't be the best it could be.
And is this easier at this size?
It's become easier in that now I capture it digitally, and so I can immediately, and the technology and the color management of technology has moved a lot, but I can adjust. Like in these, and I won't go too much in detail, but in these, what these allowed me to do in the new cameras is that this new camera I have allows me to focus stack. So I can set my foreground, which could be quite close. It could be like in that picture, my foreground is maybe, 3 feet away from the lens at the very beginning of the picture. And at the very back, it's probably 100 feet away from the lens. And I'm able to say I'm going to set the back point on this camera and set the front point, and a fairly wide open f-stop, because if you close down a lot, which is depth of field, as you make your iris smaller, you get more depth of field, which gives you foreground to background sharpness. But you lose sharpness by being at a very small aperture. So f11, which is a medium aperture, you get less depth of field. And so what I was able to do with this camera is take the less depth of field and then say, okay, break foreground to background into 10 different shots, and that's why it has to be a still day, nothing can move. And over a period of a minute, the camera autofocuses and moves back and incrementally does those 10 images. Then you take all of those images, you drop them into software, and the software then finds the sharp from front to back, and then you can do something that was previously impossible to do. So again, for the first time, I'm using a tool that wasn't even available 2-3 years ago.
And you just told me something I didn't know. There's a temporal
there's
aspect.
time.
There's a minute. It takes a minute to do.
Yeah, from beginning to end.
Okay.
It's at least a minute. So any windy day, I can't shoot.
Right.
If I'm doing the stacking. And oftentimes I'd be shooting and I'd get to the 8th frame and a breeze would come along and I'd say, okay, I got to do that again. So sometimes I'd have to do it 5-6 times before I think I got still through all of it, right?
So there's the time that it took you to do that, and there's the time that it takes us to move our eyes, our bodies move through it. I think that I didn't know that it took time. But sorry, we were talking about, is it easier than
once you have the final print, yes. Once you get the final print and all the nuance that you want out of it, and the tones and everything, then the systems are now fairly, you don't have to put the negative back in the enlarger, you don't have dust and focus issues and sizing issues and all that. Once you have the file and you have a big 60-inch printer, you can then print it and you get the exact same result. So the second one looks exactly like this one, whereas in the analog world, like we call it the butterfly dance in front of the lens to dodge and burn and to get it the way you want it. So there were never two that were alike. As much as you'd want to, human kind of, that human dance that you do to dodge and burn is never the same twice. Whereas these are identical from one to the next.
You haven't mentioned the work that you have to do on the computer as well, knitting
the computer,
together.
all the dodging and burning is done on computer at this point, and contrast control and color and density is all on the computer in Photoshop. But going back to the size, I think when you have a bigger image like this, the small details, the things become significant. And that never happens in a small, you get a general feeling of the composition, but you don't have the relationship to the nuance, to the small detail. And that body experience and that ability to go in and out and to see it, in its whole, and then to go and have that second experience with it, deep inside the structure of it, that to me is an interesting thing, is that the it's a dynamic viewing experience. It's meant for you to see it from afar and to go and give it that, what I call the 6-inch gaze. You just put your face right up to it and you look at it. And all my work is always aimed that I want the viewer to engage with that. I want that back and forth, because there is something in photography that I've fallen in love with from the very beginning, which is that the articulation of the real world in detail in such a way that there is no other tool that does that. It's the lens and it's the capturing of light, whether it's through film or digital, that, in many ways, there is nothing that surpasses that. That is we're now finding new light field things and other ways of capturing reality, but by and large, it still is, whether it's film or anything, it's still the real world through a lens onto some sensitive material, whether it's analog material or whether it's digital back, but it still is that translation of the world through an optic and captured and frozen.
There are a lot of critics who say this isn't photography. There's a lot of writing. I was going to get to that whole problem. Are these photographs, they're not infinitely reproducible from a negative. They're not made by a completely automatic process. All the things that define photography for us and have since its invention in the early 19th century. You still feel this is photography?
Yeah, quite frankly, with the new, because what this camera also did is that they've come up with a super high density sensor. So it's 6 centimeters by 7 centimeters, or it's about that size. It's like 6'7". They've had this relationship with a lens maker in Germany, Schneider lenses, and they've matched the optics to the back. And kind of where I left off in 2006, I think I kind of laid down my 8x10 camera at that time. And so I found that when I got to, I had a Hasselblad, which was 100 megapixel, and I felt I was kind of already, I was at 4x5 level, like in the film level. I was at least that, if not better. And I think this now approaches like what the 8x10 camera did. And just to give you a perspective on 8x10, if back when you shot a whole roll of 36 and made a contact sheet, that contact sheet sits on an 8x10. So I'm doing, in one shot, I'm doing all the data and all the visual kind of surface of information that a whole roll of 36 in one shot. So the result is these really rich, creamy, high color images that are, they're still, I look at my 8x10 prints from, the early 90s, and they're still as interesting to me. They're just very rich. There's a different feel to them, but this is now kind of at that level. I can't see any grain or structure of the actual.
No, there's a lot of similarities, but these are made by you like an artist. They're stitched together. It's not an automatic process that just makes your 8x10 camera made that picture. Okay, you composed, you organized, you found the right image. But anyway, I won't belabor this, but I think it's very interesting that you are now an artist. You started out as an artist. You have worked to that aspect of art where it's actually crafting together, stitching together, choosing this, choosing that, rather than having a machine which simply makes the picture and leaves you much less control. That's true. Yeah. Both are beautiful, but you can see where the critics talk about, especially in relation to Jeff Wall as well, and in relation to you, is this still photography? I'm going to leave this to everybody to have their own thoughts about that, or to answer that question, and move on to, I started with Friedrich and the Sublime, and I actually want to throw in abstract expressionism, because I see there's a lot of relation to that as well in this work. There's the overallness, there's the infinite variation that you find in Jackson Pollock, and in fact, Pollock also works with the drips that are near and far, the drips that are so sharp at underneath the larger twirls of paint and on the surface. And I'm wondering if that relationship with abstract expressionism plays a part in your thinking
Well,
about the world?
Yeah, well, I think it just comes up all the time in that I've always, if you look through, and it's not all the work, but it's in every one of my books, you'll see that I always dip into that area at some point. And sometimes I might just do a classic composition like an 18th century image, or sometimes I'll do a complete full frame flattening. But I do like the kind of flattened field, and where the image doesn't kind of pick up in the traditional spot like we often see images begin somewhere beyond our feet, and then it goes up, and it's a way in which we understand the world. And many compositions and any pictures that we take with our iPhones or everything are usually at whatever our height is, standing, or and the world breaks away at that level. I'm always interested in where the world begins at the bottom, but it doesn't let you flow up. It just starts like a wall of information. There's a flattening of space, and it is that all overness. And whether it was, Diebenkorn or Pollock, or that kind of really complex kind of visual retinal kind of reaction to the energy almost. To me, they were about energy,
And color.
And color.
I mean, if you think of Rothko as well as Pollock, yes, in terms of the energy, but the fields of color, the luminosity of the color that is in these pictures, I think is really redolent of that understanding of the world and of the overallness. Yeah. Overallness as luminous color.
Right, and luckily there was like lichen that was yellow, and the dogwood which was red, and there was like these perfect colors that were at work, so I could coax them out. And interestingly, like the closest I come to green is the green shoots at the very back picture on this side. But as soon as the leaves came, it all, to me, the magic goes away. It's just like this wall, and you can make maybe one interesting picture of leaves or whatever, but that's kind of it. Whereas when you look into the deeper structures of what the carriers of all the leaves, to me, it's far more interesting. It's far more subtle, and the tones, which I did call quarter tones, and it may be from Wallace's poem. Motive for Metaphor, where I might have got it at one point, but I did often refer to that time of year where you don't have the full-on color, but they're all the subdued colors with a lot of neutral in it. And that neutral gray is also important, because then the colors that are there become far more interesting, or your eye, they start to have an effect on, again, a retinal effect on your eye, and the way in which that kind of dance of color happens on the surface. So to me, color is more interesting, probably having come out of shooting black and white for almost 12 years before I ever picked up a color camera. So I almost always carried some of that kind of monochrome feel to it that I always liked. And so I'm always more interested in more of a subtle color within a monochrome field, and rarely ever do I shoot on sunny days. So all of this is, conditions had to be perfect. It couldn't be windy, and it couldn't be sunny. And a few days I did go out in the sun and try, and there are a couple of images that are, the one behind the desk is on a sunny day. So every once in a while something would work, but I was just kind of dogged in that I've got to be able to make sun somehow work in an image. But it's interesting, on a cloudy day, I'd be shooting all the time and finding things to work with. On a sunny day, I'd go for hours and not see anything, and then all of a sudden, maybe there's something there, and then, so it was like, I'd say 10 times harder to work with sunny conditions than it was with these overcast conditions.
Extraordinary. And you think that does come from the working in black and white, the having to compose and make the good image without the...
And the subtlety and the kind of colors that I like, the kind of colors that spoke to me, occurred in those conditions.
If we talk about abstract expressionism, if we look at these pictures and we talk about color, we talk about the acuity of the vision, we have to go back to the idea of the emotional response, the sense of awe, the sense of beauty that we feel. I think that's very much important, and I think also we have to bring in, or I want to bring in, the whole notion of Canadian landscape, which is this brush, this wilderness, is it not? And you know, how important that is to us as a country, how actually the landscape and the group of seven and other painters has defined the country for us. So this is also part of a tradition that I see you belong to. Do you think you belong to it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, McDonald's Tangled Garden, or if you look at a lot of the, you know, Tom Thompson, who wasn't part of it, but again, you know, just the way they organized, you know, and looked at the landscape, you know, yeah, there's no doubt that there's a kind of a sharing in a vision. Yeah, you mentioned you've mentioned in the past we've talked about Gordon Smith. Gordon Smith is interesting because he, as a West Coast painter, because he had that same interest in that kind of dynamic, complex web of you know, trees, brush, you know, the forest. But it's interesting, I came to his work well after I'd already been in it for a long time, so I'd certainly seen the group of seven, and I'd certainly kind of been exposed and gone to galleries and saw, you know, what Pollock and what those abstract expressionist artists were doing, and, you know, field painters, and I think that kind of amalgamation of some of those ways of seeing and the large format color camera were the things that kind of all came together for me.
We were talking about art and painting, but I think it's important also to talk about the history of photography. Again, the subject matter is very much, reminds me very much of the 19th century. You were talking about black and white photography, 19th century black and white photography. The work of Gustave Le Gray in the Forest of Fontainebleau, I don't know how familiar people in this audience are, but he too was photographing large images as much as one could make large images. You've talked about the limits of that, and of trees. And you've brought the tree to our attention in a way that gives it an almost humanoid, I think of the single tree back here. You're making a portrait of this work. You're making the human empathy that is needed to understand nature part of, you're bringing that out in your work, I think.
Well, I think, yeah, and somehow it's just, like I started with it, and then if you look at, so I kind of I left this kind of body of works. So, I mean, this, just as an example, I'll show you one that, so this image here, 4x5, up in the Bruce Peninsula, back where I fell in love with it, 1981. So this is 1981. And if you look at that and you compare it with the snow picture, you know, and there is this kind of centrality to it at the same kind of part of the frame, and there's the energy kind of flow above it. So that was a kind of the image that was in the back of my mind when I went back out again as a point of departure. But it is very much, you know, trying to move, you know, that energy and thinking about, you know, the past and the, you know, photographers who had inspired me, like an Elliot Porter, and there was a few others in color who, there weren't many that I could look to. And so those were, like, looking at color felt kind of like as if I'm in an area that I'm still able to kind of find my own language, pioneer my own way. And there was about 1982, I kind of ran out of steam in this way of seeing. And then I thought, well, maybe, you know, what's going to become far more in keeping with my time is to look at how we usurp nature, look at our own footprint and how it's expanding into nature, and so the diminishment of biodiversity and the natural order to a more systemic human monoculture order. Because when we put a farm in there, that's one crop, it's almond trees, or it's, you know, palm plantations, or it's whatever. So to me, it was that pushing back of nature. You know, so almost for 40 years, I've been in this kind of moment of photographing things which I kind of look at as a 40-year lament for a loss of a natural order to our success. And so there is something about coming, being pinned by this virus and coming back around to nature when we are at a kind of a point of making a planetary decision as a species as to whether we tip it over to a point where it becomes unrecognizable or uninhabitable, or we pull back from that precipice. But I feel at this point that we are on a precipice, we're on an edge, and we can tip over. And it's a question of what happens over the next decade or two as to what our chances are. So to me, to go back and stare at nature and think about it and meditate on it felt like it was the right thing to do.
And to remove, there's no narrative, there's no human, it's a pure presence and a pure meditation. To the point, I would say that you give, I've said before, you make a portrait of that tree, almost as if it were human. So you've removed the human intervention and you've sensed a human empathy in the nature that is in front of you. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think the thing that I found that I had to really, the space I had to be in to make these pictures was something of being humbled by it. That I had to feel that there was a force here that I was photographing that is an enduring force that will continue and it will always be there.
And that's empathy, and you make us feel that.
Well, I'm trying to get through it. Now, whether I can't say, but I always, as an artist, you hope if you're feeling it, someone else can feel it, and that's, I think, where the creative, translation of what artists do is that we can't actually be sure, but we can try, and to see if but it is a kind of a humbling to place yourself. And it was interesting when I was photographing it, a couple times the police had stopped to think, would you have a problem, or what are you doing, And they'd look at what I'm photographing, they go, I have no idea what you're doing,
What are you looking at?
What are you looking at? I mean, there's nothing there, right? I mean, so it is fascinating that it's there, and it is a kind of a dialing in, I find. It's a very, very, very nuanced thing in perception, and oftentimes I could see it and it would disappear, it would come back, or sometimes there's nothing. So it isn't like it's just like it presents itself and it's there. It is a kind of like entering a space, and it's it's like a maze, and you have to find your way into the picture. It doesn't deliver itself to you. You have to
make it.
Yeah, you have to go in there.
You have to impose an order.
Yeah, you have to find your way into it. You know, it's not something that, there it is. It's not. It doesn't work that way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for coming.